from Slack. Carl definitely needs no introduction, but I'm still going to do that anyways. But before that, I'll love if everyone can jump in the comments, share where you're calling from, maybe share a little bit about yourself, know each other in the audience. Oh, I think there is some form of, yep. Okay, sorry, there was some form of feedback. Yep. So jump in the comments, tell us where you're calling from. We're super excited to have all of you. My name is Felix, and I'm the co-founder at ADPList. I'm currently based in Singapore. So good morning for anyone who is calling from Asia. And Carl here is based in Oakland, which is in California. Hey, Carl, thanks for joining in. So a little bit about Carl. Carl is currently the Director of Design Infrastructure at Slack. And Carl is an award-losing designer. He called himself that has worked across branding, product design for over a decade, from working in studios to leading in-house teams at places like Etsy and Dropbox. And fun fact, we even have a mutual friend that he has here in Singapore as well. And when he's not hanging pen on the digital waves or the World Wide Web, he can be found working to make people's working lives a little bit more fabulous as the design director of infrastructure here at Slack. And he's based in Oakland. So let's welcome Carl for today's exclusive session on ADPList. Carl, in case I miss anything about your introduction, would you like to share some things about yourself before we get started?
Hey, hello everyone. Thanks for joining. I actually have a little intro slide here. If I can, let's see if this works. Hello. So, hey, my name is Kyle Turman, like Felix said, and my pronouns are he, him, and I am a Senior Director of Product Design at Slack, the Director of Design Infrastructure, and I'm really glad to join you all. So good morning, good evening, wherever you're at. This, I think, session overall, we're going to be talking a little bit about pillars of product design, and this is based on an article that I wrote for Slack Design's blog. And it's pinned to the top of my Twitter there at Kyle Turman, or you can find it at slack.design as well. And I'm just going to go over really quickly what it kind of looks like to think about pillars of product design here. So you can read the full article and we'll talk a little bit more in detail, but here's just kind of a quick recap. So basically, when we think about the pillars of product design, I like to think of these as kind of broad categories of skill sets, the skills and thrills of designing for digital products in 2022. So one of the first pillars there is user-centered problem solving. So that's around this idea of empathetic discovery, trying to understand this curiosity of understanding what problems exist, identifying what goals there are, company goals, user goals, who you're building for, who you're designing for, the audience. Framing problems, being able to understand how to take those things and frame it in a way that's helpful for other people. That could be using user stories or personas or a bunch of other different ways. That could also be facilitating idea generation through design sprints, workshops, things like that. Also user testing, feedback, and validation. All of those kind of come into this user-centered problem-solving pillar. Then there's also user interface and experience design. And I think this is kind of what, probably most people think of when they think designer, but this is one part of it, right? Like the user experience design, understanding how someone journeys through your product, how they flow through it, what error states come up, the actual brand and visual design of things, right? And so you can see the aubergine purple background here that's part of Slack's branding, the visual and user interface design. The motion and interaction design parts of these things as well, as something responds to something you tap or click. Also content design. We have actual content designers at Slack that do amazing jobs helping us be able to actually put words inside of our designs that actually make sense, but that's a big part of this as well. And then also accessibility, thinking about the color contrast, thinking about screen readers, thinking about people with different levels of abilities coming into being able to use your product. And then lastly, something that probably doesn't get taught in schools as much as the first two is really thinking about this idea of collaboration and communication. So how do you document and share your ideas? How do you use your design powers to be able to take the ideas that are in your head and put it on some form of digital paper that your teammates can understand? And then how do you receive feedback and give feedback well, and how to shape alignment on these things? And then also, how do you collaborate with engineers? Be able to understand some of the key aspects of HTML and CSS if you're working on the web, or iOS, you're working with Swift and Objective-C. Android, you're working with Kotlin. You don't necessarily need to know how to code, but kind of understanding how to speak that same language. All of those are kind of really core skills inside of collaboration and communication. And so when we think about that at Slack, that kind of breaks down into this process overall for our design process, where we have discovery, where we're discovering what the problem is and what we want to solve for, the definition of what we think it is that we're actually going to solve for that problem, and then delivering that, being able to say, all right, let's prototype this and figure out if this is a good solution, deliver that to customers, get feedback on it, and then refine it. And then we kind of keep going through that cycle. That's kind of our product development process. And so when we think about that, I actually tweeted about this earlier today. There's also ways that we can think about that in terms of layering truth, right? So starting with this idea, is this the right problem? And then is it the right direction? And then is this the best solution? And then is this the best implementation? So kind of stacking those things up as we kind of figure out, yes, this is the thing we all decide on, and then moving up through there. So that's kind of a quick recap. I'll switch back to non-sharing mode here, and wanted to just give that recap of the pillars of product design. The article is available to read if you want to read it, and happy to talk more.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Cal. So we're going to now move into the fireside chat, with Cal on the topic of, these pillars of design that Cal has written on his blog. So if you're interested and you're keen, we're going to send the resource to you right after this session today. But we're super excited to dive a little bit deeper into what actually inspired Cal to write all of this. So Cal, the first question actually, when I had while reading this through, it's sort of like, obviously we understand that, you must have an amazing, like, busy schedule, right? And so, like, what inspired you to actually write this article in the first place? Was there something wrong that you wanted to write, or was there something that actually triggered you to write this, piece of article here about the pillars of design?
Yeah, so it's interesting when we interview candidates at Slack who are, wanting to work with us. I've gotten to talk to some amazing designers, and some parts of it are just not everyone kind of has this shared definition of what a product designer is. And so there's a lot of different ways that people think about creating, digital products today. There are some companies that have dedicated UI designers and dedicated UX designers. Product design is kind of a mix of both of those together. And so I wanted to kind of be able to help define that a little bit, and at least kind of put some rough areas around what generally a product designer does, to help people who are maybe trying to break into the industry or trying to understand better the expectations of a product designer as they're thinking about applying to jobs and growing their career.
Right. And do you think, ever since you wrote this article, do you think that the industry has changed, has shifted a little bit in terms of the mindset and how people are viewing product design as the way that you had described in this article?
I mean, it changes all the time. Like, as new tools and as new things develop, right? Like, trying to keep up with some things is difficult.
Right.
And, there's a lot of people thinking about things like the metaverse and Web3, and trying to understand those things also, it can be kind of distracting. But what I really tried to focus on are, what are the core pillars, right? Like, no matter what you're working on, what are the things that you kind of consistently need to understand, no matter what the case is?
Yeah.
And that's kind of my experience based on, 15 or so years of working in this industry. These are kind of the core things that I always fall back to.
Yeah. So, like, from branding to content to accessibility, UI, UX, those are all the core pillars. And I'm just curious, like, you have a lot of, like, this exciting and I think very, very necessary pillars. But what do you see, in terms of, like, things that are happening outside of the pillars? Are there things that are happening outside of the pillars that, that might not be mentioned, you think?
It's definitely possible. I think as we have more, like, no code tools starting to come out, there's this interesting hybrid between someone who can design something and make something and build something, right? And so back in the day, I had to learn how to code to be able to build anything. But now we have amazing tools like Webflow, and even Framer now has ability to create sites that you can do a lot of that without needing to have an engineer, like, look over everything for some projects, right? And so I think that that's kind of an interesting space to get into, and especially thinking about like 3D and Blender and some of these tools that are coming out too. I think we're going to see a lot more interesting convergence, is kind of my guess, between like the actual design tools and the like building tools.
Right. Thanks for sharing that. So if anyone listening, so all of you should be expecting all these tools that are coming up, new tools like Spline and everything else out there, no code tools. And Carl, I'm curious, like you mentioned that there are these key pillars and you've been here for like decades, how has these pillars actually evolved? And, are there any sort of like advice that you recommend designers on this call today to adapt to those changes consistently? Because there might be some things that has remained consistent for 15 years and there might be some things that has changed. In your opinion, what has changed and how can people adapt to those changes continuously?
Yeah, so I think part of it is, when I started, we were making like Flash websites, and some of those same things still come to life, right? And there's actually some old Flash websites that I actually miss because they had character to them. They had interesting hover effects in different ways that kind of created delight. And I think those things create this kind of loyalty and brand love that sometimes we miss when we're kind of making everything look the same. Like I think that's something that happens a lot where we just want it to look like standardized and consistent, but we kind of miss on some of those ideas of actually making software that feels personable, like it's been made by a human being. And so I think that's something that I've continued to see throughout is like, especially as tools develop, like people deserve to have software that feels like it's made by a human, because otherwise everything will just feel robotic, So I think that's something that has always been the case for me anyway.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I think this is a very interesting segue into one of the things that I really am keen to dive deeper into, because, as someone who uses Slack almost on a daily basis, in fact, I'm kind of like you to say that sometimes I even use that on a weekend as well. I'm not sure if that's the intended use case when you design that, but I'm curious, like, at Slack or just on a personal level, like how do you, because you mentioned about designing for humans and making it feel human, how do you conduct actually effective feedback sessions that actually captures the user's thoughts and emotional perspective? And these are things that, to be honest, like sometimes it's so hard to capture through surveys or sometimes even through some interviews that it might be hard to bring out from the user's point of view. So how do you conduct effective sessions that could actually bring out and capture accurate emotions and perspective from the user's point of view, even sometimes that they don't realize?
Yeah, totally. Well, we have an incredible user research team here at Slack that does really awesome work. And so there's different types of user research that you can do. When you're actually doing a project, and designing something, a lot of times we think about usability testing, right? Like, can someone use this thing that I designed? But sometimes it's helpful to think like before that, if you're trying to improve on something, like we've done things like diary studies and interviews. One of our user researchers, Raz, is doing some really amazing coffee chats where she just like schedules time with customers and records it and just talk to them about things. Because there's this aspect of both, the qualitative and the quantitative, of being able to understand kind of more on the qualitative side, those more emotional aspects of things. And you can kind of get that in surveys or user interviews, perhaps. But sometimes it's just trying to understand, like, all right, what about Slack don't you like? What do you like? And that can kind of fuel some things that can help us start to figure out, like, all right, this is the thing we should focus on. Like recently, we've been thinking about focus in general. How can we actually design Slack to help you focus instead of the opposite? So sometimes with notifications and other things, things can pop in. And so our user research team has done some pretty extensive research on that to try to just understand, how can we help people focus better? So those kind of like more preemptive research sessions, I think, are really good for capturing that type of thing.
That's amazing. I think Slack has introduced, a lot of amazing features, and quite recently, hurdles, right? So, I realized that me and my team has been trying to get each other to hurdle every now and then. And in fact, I use that probably on a daily basis. So anyone who's using hurdle, please give a shout out to the team in the comments below. Just say that, you're using hurdle or something. Just leave a comment there so that the Slack team actually knows that you're using it. But Carl, I'm curious, like with all the user feedback that you're getting, with Resh, who is like, conducting these coffee chats, how do you align your team in terms of decision making, right? Because I imagine that there will be so much feedback from the Slack users. You guys are so big as a company, right? So how do you align your team in terms of decision making, guiding them down the best path, while also considering different user feedback and different dynamics of the team?
Yeah, and that's kind of where this first pillar really comes in, right? Of like trying to understand the user problems and user goals, as well as the business problem and business goals, right? And so I think that that's something that, I learned at Etsy, which was at a certain point, we went through some layoffs, some things happened, the business was kind of in a rough shape. And I used to have this kind of philosophy that is, if you just design beautiful things, like people will come, people will do it. Good design will save everything. And, we have products like RDO and other things that kind of show that that's not necessarily the case. So I think part of it is trying to understand, where is our company going? What is our company strategy? How do we kind of help understand some of these business aspects, but also balance those with the user needs, right? Like we don't want to do something that is against what a user needs, but we want to do something that also creates kind of a sustainable business for us as well. And so part of that is trying to help get user information or user research and more qualitative data about how people are feeling, and then shape that into a strategy that also works well with the business to prioritize certain things, right? And so based on those things, we can sometimes say, yeah, let's focus on this over that. And then sometimes we actually have this really cool prototype the path philosophy at Slack, where we try and prototype things. We'll try it on an idea and we'll build it and we'll just see how it works. And then sometimes it doesn't work very well. And so sometimes it's helpful to just, try the ideas out and see what works and see what doesn't, and then have that inform your next session. That's kind of that idea of like layering truth.
That's amazing. And I imagine there would be a lot of documentation to document down these lessons that you've learned, these mistakes that you've made, or these successes that you have had. So are there any sort of like best practices or tools to document this decision-making process for such a big team at Slack?
Well, I mean, I think we could always improve on it. We actually use Slack quite a bit for that. I think at one point, I think someone had said that the acronym for Slack was like source and log of all centralized knowledge or something like that. I don't know, but we use, you can search in Slack. We use Slack very, very intensely at Slack.
Okay.
And so, I mean, that's one way we do it. And then also trying to figure out how we bake that into our design systems as well. That's something we're working on now, trying to understand how we can help anything that we learn from continually evolve the standards that we set. And so that's kind of another way as well.
Gotcha. Thanks for sharing that. And I think it's so important that these decisions are being documented so that the team, in the future or the present could learn as well. Obviously, we don't document them on Slack right now, but it's something that perhaps we should try, and anyone in the comments or today in the audience can try as well. Now, I want to dive a little bit more into sort of like the pillars and the people who might learn something from these pillars. And in fact, all of us here can learn a lot from the pillars. Like, do you think there is any particular pillar that is, that should come first in terms of priorities when we're thinking about something? Or do you think that all pillars should at least be considered in the same weightage, if you will?
I mean, that's why I kind of call them pillars. Like that's the, these are kind of the foundational pieces.
Yeah.
And so I think they all have like a certain amount of weight. And kind of what I was saying before is that I think sometimes we might focus too much on the visuals because that's what everyone sees, right? And everyone has like this idea of like, oh yeah, a designer is like, has cool glasses and wears a cool hat and like makes like really cool dribble posts. I don't know if people still use dribble, so maybe that just dated me. But I think it's like balance, making sure those things are balanced out, right? With being able to both have that curiosity and that user-driven approach, and then also that collaboration bit as well. And so I think really it's about balance and creating that balance. And one thing we kind of talk about in the industry sometimes is this idea of like a T-shaped skill set, where you kind of have the balance of some of these skills, and then you might have one area in particular that you want to go really deep on. So for me, that T-shaped skill is probably pizza and code. That would be my deep understanding. Those are the things I really care about. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. I mean, some of us here might be burritos and design or something, but it's
Totally
great. I love pizza. Not going to get into the topic of whether pineapple should be on pizza, but like talking about T-shaped skill set, I think it's a really interesting topic because recently I've seen some tweets and I even tweeted myself that one of the best career advice that I personally got was being a generalist at the start. So explore everything. Be as wide as possible, and then dive into a specialization later on. I want to hear that from your perspective, or rather from your journey. Maybe you could share some examples. Like, how did that look for you in the earlier days of your career? Like, were you a generalist, or did you already knew what you wanted and you just dive into it?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting because I started in college. Like, they didn't have product design wasn't something you could study when I went to college. Like, and so I studied computer science for a bit, and then I actually switched to graphic design halfway through. And so I always kind of had like this coding background, and people kept asking me for coding things. Like when responsive web became a thing, when iOS became a thing, back when it was called iPhone OS. People were like, "Oh yeah, can you do this? You know how to code, right?" And so it became a kind of thing where people just kept asking for it based on my experience. And so that's kind of what I think is kind of interesting, is that I kind of stumbled into that in some ways. And sometimes I think people might be a little too, actively intentional about trying to create that T shape, where they're like, "Oh, I really want to be this," or whatever. I actually really wanted to be a brand designer because I thought brand designers were cool. All the brand designers I knew were like, the coolest people. And I tried it and I just wasn't very good at it. That's not really like my forte. But I kind of figured out like, oh, this is something I'm good at and that I don't hate doing. Like I really enjoy code, but I love to use code as a tool to create what I want to create, right? And so I think part of that is just kind of giving yourself time to explore those things, and kind of like, I don't think you necessarily have to intentionally become a generalist all at once first and then discover what your T-shape is. It's more just kind of like figuring out your own path. Like some people's T-shape I found is actually like user research. Like they're really good at being able to work with customers. Some people is just collaboration and communication. So all of those things are natural skill sets that you might have. And really, I think it's about like trying to let those things come out in you and be patient with yourself. You don't have to be me. Like, I'd rather you not actually. Be yourself, figure out what those things are. And that's kind of what your T-shaped skill set can kind of naturally become over time.
Gotcha. Sounds good. Definitely a great advice. And I have like one very curious question as you were actually sharing this. I was wondering, like, would you advise someone to do something that they are like really good at, but they don't enjoy doing that? Or would you advise someone to do something that they might not be good at, but they really enjoy that? Because I'm sure some people, that are growing into this career or breaking into an industry, they really enjoy design, but they might not be good at it yet right now, right? And they might be good at something, but they just don't really enjoy that. So, do you have any sort of like advice for people who are in that position, that unique position right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it, enjoyment too, is like understanding, is it the idea of like personal enjoyment? Is it intrinsic? Or is it the idea that you want to be something that you want to show someone else? Is it extrinsic? Right. And so for me, like I wanted to be a brand designer, not necessarily because I enjoyed it, but because I thought it would make me look cool. And that's the thing. That's totally fine. Right. That's reasonable. We're all human. But I think it's like understanding, if you're really good at something, but you don't like doing it, then you're probably not actually good at that thing, because it's something that if it doesn't give you that like personal, reward and value, it can just lead to burnout. Like what I found creatively is that creatively, you should be getting back more than you put in general. And anytime that isn't the case, that you don't get that same amount of energy back. Like when I design a really amazing, cool hover interaction on a button, whew, gives me chills. I love it. It gives me so much energy. And that is worth, all of the weird web transforms and stuff that I have to overcome, and so that's worth it to me. That makes it worth it, even though I don't necessarily always love navigating npm and all of the build environments and everything like that. I enjoyed that part of it. So I think part of it is figuring out what it is that you actually enjoy and what gives you that energy. And a lot of it is just trial and error and figuring it out, like I had to figure out that I'm not necessarily good at brand design, nor does it really give me energy. So, and when I say that, I mean like making logos. Like I still have branding as a bigger thing, but making logos, that's a hard thing that I'm not great at.
Oh, okay. Making logos is actually hard. If anyone has not tried that before, I would recommend you to maybe take a weekend off and try to explore that, because it's not as easy as you all think. There's so much thought process that goes behind it, especially great brands, like truly great brands. Now, I want to dive and obviously, by the way, anyone who's in the session here today, please feel free to leave your question, because we'll be jumping into a 10 to 15 minutes Q&A very shortly. But Carl, I want to chat a little bit more, for the last few minutes before we open up the floor, in terms of what it looks like to grow in responsibility, scope, and scale in your career, right? You have been here for over a decade or so. So, turning from an IC to a managerial position that you are right now, and I probably assume that with all that you're saying, you're probably still very hands-on in some ways, right? So what has changed? What has changed, and how do you think people that are in an IC position right now can grow into where you are today? What sort of advice do you have through some examples that you can share?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is understanding the aspect of leadership as something that is not necessarily correlated with management. I actually was an IC for a little bit. I've switched back and forth many times in my career between IC and management, because I like to just I like to explore. I like to try new things. And I think in the IC position, I try to exemplify leadership by mentoring people, by trying to help set a vision for the team on where we could go. And also push people and critique in ways that help build their career and create like a better overall design at the end of the day. And so there's ways that I think you can think about that in terms of leadership, right? As you're growing your career, that you're actually helping other people do their jobs better by just being yourself, by just being around them. And so part of that is, just understanding what it is that you yourself are good at, or what is valuable to you. And then trying to figure out how that can kind of manifest itself in terms of helping other people be able to do that thing better as well. And how I ended up in management is because I actually enjoyed that more than doing the design work. I really love working with people and helping them grow and helping develop their careers. And so, if that's something you really enjoy, then maybe try management. Maybe give that a whirl and work towards that. But I think it's really understanding this idea of like leadership itself, like your ability to help create more focus, more advanced skill sets. Like you existing in this role is exponential to the company and to the team. That's really what leadership kind of is at the end of the day. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, it does. And I think it comes from a place of a lot of wisdom, a lot of wise words. And one thing that I'm surprised is that, you would actually enjoy management more than you are designing, because it does sound like you enjoy designing a lot as well. So I guess it's pretty much, it's pretty much like 51 and 49 kind of thing. So with that said, we're getting a lot of questions on Pigeonhole. So I'm just going to share my screen on Pigeonhole, and we're going to pick some of the top rated questions. In fact, if any of you wants to submit any questions, please head over to the Pigeonhole. I'm going to directly take the top questions here, starting from the first one from Levy. And I believe that Levy is one of our mentors here. And he asked, how do PM and how does a product manager and a product designer work together? Oh, it just changed with the research team, especially how much the business direction is driven by product design. So I think just to sort of like sum up the question is, how do PM and product designer work together with research team, and then how much of that business direction is driving and is driven by the design team? Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. I think there's this aspect of being able to understand, early on, like what are the things that preventing us from reaching the company goals, right? So if we have a company goal to grow our business, to make more money, whatever that is, or to provide a new service to a new industry, trying to understand what the needs are in that industry or that specific area to help grow the business, that's really where we're working with research and PMs in that instance, right? To understand how do we kind of set that foundation and understand what the kind of core needs are to be able to meet that. And so we're working with them pretty closely at that point. And then also, as we're developing the product, we're also working between product and design and sometimes engineering as well to understand, is this the right solution? Are we going in the right direction? And so there's both of these aspects, right? Where we're like using research to inform our strategy, and then also using research to validate our decisions. And so both product designers and product managers, I think, work fairly closely with research in that aspect. But I think product design, to answer kind of your second question, like how it's the business direction is driven by product design, is really like how we create that user experience and what that looks like, right? So product managers might decide from research and from other things and from CE tickets that we get that, hey, this is a big problem. And then designers really kind of help understand how we solve that problem and work with PMs to help validate that and help make sure that that's the right solution. And so, it's really a big, we have PDE here at Slack, which is product design and engineering. So it's really a big collaboration between all three of us to make sure that we do design and ship something that customers really love.
All right, thanks so much for that, Carl. We're going to move on to the next question from the audience, the next top rated question, which is, there are 7 votes on this. So what are some tools or methods that you find that are really helpful for user research to inform your design decisions?
Oh, yes, so many methods. So I think part of it is, in that early stage, really trying to understand, who you're designing for. And trying to get a pretty good sense of like the types of users that you're designing for, right? So if you're like designing an entire product, you might have like a large group of people that you're designing for. If you're designing a specific feature, maybe it's a power feature, maybe it's only relevant to like a specific set of people, but it's going to be very valuable for them. What's important, I think, is trying to get as much data as you can to be able to help inform your decisions. And so some methods you can do in that space. We've used actually like Mechanical Turk with Amazon's service to actually do some like very high level surveys and send it out to people around like general usability to just like get a sense on like, okay, is this generally the feature that we have today? Like, how are people thinking about it? Is this like a good thing or a bad thing, or like how fast are people navigating through this specific thing? So there's ways you can do that with like surveys that are targeted on specific groups of individuals, right? So that's really helpful as well. And then I think also using more intentional sessions that are more guided, where you're walking through with customers, like what their problems are, trying to see things. When we were at Etsy, we used to do these seller studio visits that I just absolutely loved. I used to work on the seller experience team that helped create the tools for sellers on Etsy. And we'd go to sellers' shops and studios and see how they built things, how they processed orders. And we just try and understand, what issues they have. Because part of the issue that comes up is that people won't tell you what problems that they have. You have to kind of see them for yourself, right? Like there's so many little hacks that I have in software that I use that I'm just like, oh yeah, I'll just deal with it. But it could be better. But I'm not going to call that out. And so trying to understand those things and like get that information from users is, I think, a really important thing to do. And sometimes that's just talking to people.
Right. Gotcha. I think it reminds me a lot of, what we do here at ADPList as well, in the sense of like talking to users, making sure that, we stay close with our community. For example, we have a Slack channel with our mentors as well. And obviously,
Totally.
Those allow us to keep in real time feedback. And at the same time, we host many town halls with them, understand their feedback as well. And I'm curious, just to follow up a little bit on that question, do you think that everything you build should be for 100% of the population? So every feature that you design, every things that you improve on the platform would be for 100% of the users? that should serve everyone, or do you sort of like prioritize based on like the impact, and it might maybe only impact like 30% of the people on the platform? So what are your thoughts on that? Should a feature be designed for everyone's usage, or just for a particular set of problem that you're solving?
Yeah, I think kind of what you're getting at there is this idea of like either universal design or inclusive design. And I kind of, with Slack, like millions of people use Slack. And so there's aspects of it that we have to be fairly universal, right? Like we have to make sure it works for most people, because a lot of people don't have a choice in using Slack, right? It's like their company uses it, so they have to use it. So we have to make sure it works for them. But there are certain features, that are more geared towards specific people, and they're going to take more advantage of them. And then that gets into this aspect of, return on investment, right? Like if we're going to spend 3 months working on a project, or however long it takes to ship this thing, that has a core cost to the company. So we have to make sure that that is going to produce enough value to be able to justify that work, right? And so being able to understand those core people, is it enough? Like there's some power features that we just don't ship because it's not worth us doing it, because it's not a big enough impact on a big enough group of people. But I think that there are quite a few things where it's like, this is going to be very valuable for like half of the people or 40% of the people. And really focusing on those specific users is super helpful, because really at the end of the day, you can't design everything to meet the needs of everyone. That's just literally impossible, because humans are so different.
Yep. Thanks for sharing that. Definitely is something that, we all are trying to learn as well. So I want to move on to the next question by Lucia. Hopefully I'm not butchering the name. Is it okay to apply for a product designer role right away after a bootcamp training? And I'm sure like Carl, you and I know that, a lot of people are going through bootcamp training right now, and they have a feeling that, they should start out with as a UI UX designer and then involve in the product designer. But, the fundamental question is that should they apply to be a product designer, right out of a UX bootcamp training? So I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. I think it's definitely a big question. I think a lot of people here come from that particular background.
Yeah, I mean, I go for it. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that there's that much difference between a UX UI designer and a product designer. I think they're basically the same thing to a lot of people. Like the titles are just really different. Yep. If you're doing specifically UI design or specifically UX design, those can be different at some companies. But for a lot of smaller companies like startups and things, it's essentially the same thing. And it's like, those are the pillars that I kind of mentioned before, right? Those are kind of all the skill sets that you need to learn. And so part of it, when you're hiring, the issue that you'll run into is that people will try and look for some proof that you can do those things, right? And so all of those skills that I mentioned, you have to have some ability to show like, hey, I'm capable of doing that. And what's hard is I've been in a place too where I'm like, I know I'm capable of doing this, but I can't prove it yet. And so part of that I found too is like actually doing some like side projects, some personal projects, working with some local companies. Sometimes I've even done that, for a limited charge or like no charge for like nonprofits or other things, to just build up your skills and get some things in your portfolio to be able to show people. But really at the end of the day, like, I mean, I think the bootcamp training is really helpful to get that kind of foundation, but it's really like how you apply those skills and then try and figure out like, like we were talking about before, what are you really good at? What do you need to grow in a little bit more? Sometimes you don't know until you actually try it.
Thanks for sharing that, Carl. I just from a mentor's perspective as well, I've seen so many designers, and I think one of the things that, like I agree like deeply on is like, just go ahead, apply, especially in companies like startup, where quite frankly, the role product designer literally means everything. You got to do brand, you got to do research, you got to do everything. So go for it, that vast of experience. And there's a lot of job openings these days. So go out there, don't be afraid. All the mentors here, Carl, myself, everyone here is here to support all of you in this community. So go for it, learn as much as you can. Now I'm gonna sum up with a couple last questions, and then
sure.
I'm gonna have a last final question for you, Carl. That is I call it like my signature question for any guest that attends my show. So it's a surprise question. It's not listed actually.
Awesome.
So there's this question, final question from the audience that I'll take is, what do you think is the hardest part of your job as a product designer for yourself?
It changes all the time. I think like something that is generally hard to figure out is what does done look like, right? I think like the reality is that with digital design as well, like something is never done. You could continue iterating on it. It could always be better. And so I often say with design, like it's not about figuring out what the best thing is, but it's the least worst thing that you could create, you know? And so getting to that point where you're able to ship something and then get feedback on it is incredibly important. But sometimes letting go of that as a designer, like we get really attached to things. I think that's one aspect that can be really hard, especially early on in your career. Trying to figure out like how you can let go and be okay with, you know, shipping something that you're like, man, maybe this could be a little bit better, but you need to get that feedback from folks before you actually understand if it's good or bad, or if it's going to work for them or if it's not going to work for them. So I think that's a really big part that's like really hard, is like figuring out what that balance is and how to find something that ships and is still going to solve your customer needs and your user needs. And also like is something that you're proud of, but also something that you don't spend forever working on.
That is the perfect answer for that. In fact, like that's so perfect. I mean, like it's the last question, and obviously I agree with you. Like, what does done looks like? I think that's always the big question for any designer, and it's always an iterative process for everyone. So thanks for sharing that, Carl. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I know that we have some questions left, but I would our team will try to work with Carl, and if Carl could answer some of those questions after the session or whatnot, we'll be happy to share them through a blog post, and then forward those resources to the entire community and all of you here today. Carl, I want to wrap up today's session with, like I say, one surprise signature question that I call it, in which I think it always brings out the best from someone. And the question goes something like this: through your career, you have like decades, probably a decade or more experience today. What is one advice that you feel that people would disagree with you with? What is one career advice that you feel that people will disagree with you with, but you will still stand firmly on that particular advice that you continue to give someone, right? Everyone could disagree, right? Or like everyone had already disagreed with you, but you would still give that advice. What would that be for people listening in today?
I think it would be that there is no, as someone who just wrote an article saying this is what a product designer is, there's no one definition of what a product designer is. And I think part of that is understanding to a certain degree, trying not to compare yourself to other people, trying to figure out what it is that you intrinsically are interested in and what you want to help the world with is something that is way more important than trying to be like the coolest, product designer with all of the Twitter followers and whatever. Like, that's not what's important. What's really important at the end of the day is that you are able to find something that you can contribute back to the world that you feel gives you energy and gives the world energy, right? Like, the world is such a crazy place, especially the past few years. Anything that we can do to add brilliance and joy and delight into the world is so worth it. And sometimes those things get bogged down with like all the career advancement, and you're like, oh, I've got to do this and I've got to do this and I've got to hit this point. It's fine. You'll get there. You can just breathe and just like slowly work on things. Like, that's something I still struggle with at 15 years into my career, of trying to be something sometimes that I'm not, trying to be something that someone else wants me to be. And so I think, some people will disagree with that. I firmly believe that it's about trying to find that aspect inside yourself where you feel like you can live your life and be yourself, and whatever that entails. I think that's a very important thing, more than your career to a certain degree.
Thank you so much for reminding all of us, that very, very important piece of advice here today, Carl. And I'm sure all of us could appreciate that reminder, myself included, and everyone here. So thank you so much, Carl. And with that said, we have come to the end of today's session. I hope that everyone had enjoyed your time here with Carl, in this exclusive session. And we're super, super humble and, just extremely grateful to have Carl here today. And so in terms of next steps, in terms of like being Slack being a workplace, sort of like tool. In terms of next steps, all of you will receive a copy of this recording, and as well as we'll be writing a blog regarding Carl's session today, so that we can all be reminded of Carl's advice today continuously. And so, Carl, I want to personally thank you for joining in today's session and event, and I look forward to the next one with the team at Slack. And thank you all so much for joining in today's session. Thank you all so much, and see you all very soon. Thanks, Carl.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful
day. Thanks, Carl, for
day.
joining in. Have a wonderful one.